Good afternoon. Hasn't this been a great day? I was in earlier session. I've not been here all day, but the sessions I was able to attend have been wonderful. And this next session, our final session, promises to be even better. I have the high honor this afternoon of introducing Governor Tim Kaine, who I'm sure all of you know. Nonetheless, bear with me while I give you, I don't know, a 12 or 14 page introduction. 3 paragraphs. Let me just tell you a little bit about Governor Kaine. He is, of course, a lifetime public servant who served as the 70th governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia from January of 2006 until January of 2010. Then served as lieutenant governor from 2002 to 2006, and of course, mayor of Richmond from 1998 to 2001. He was elected chair of the Democratic National Committee in January of 2009. Equally important, he returned to the university this past January after having taught legal ethics here in our law school between 1987 and 1993. Governor Kaine has a joint appointment. He is appointed both in our School of Law and in the Jepson School of Leadership. So he's teaching in both. Governor Kaine grew up in Kansas City. He attended the University of Missouri and, of course, Harvard Law School. He began his public service career when he took a year off from law school in 1980 when he volunteered with Jesuit missionaries in Honduras. And you may be interested what he did there. He served as the principal of a technical school that taught teenagers basic carpentry and welding skills. He then, after graduating from law school, practiced law in Richmond for 17 years, representing people who had been denied housing opportunities because of race or disability. Governor Kaine is married to Ann Holton, who is a foster care reform advocate who worked previously as a legal aid lawyer and a juvenile court judge. They have 3 children. It is a distinct honor and privilege for us to welcome Governor Kaine back to our campus, as he is here every Monday teaching our students. Join me in welcoming our esteemed faculty colleague, Governor Tim Kaine.
Hey, thank you all very much. Thank you. Well, I want to thank Steve for his kind words and all of you for coming. It's a real treat to have a chance to come and complete what I know has been a very exciting day. I had lunch earlier with one of the speakers from earlier, Betsy Myers, who's an old friend, and I know she was very impressed by the quality of the dialogue and questions. And I can't promise to be the most exciting, but I am the one right before the reception. So I know that may hold some of you in, even if I'm not exciting. But thanks for coming. I am thrilled to be back at the university. I taught here for 7 years, and I taught ethics, legal ethics, professional responsibility at the law school. And so when the Jepson Law School, Business School were exploring this seminar this year on ethics, and they asked if I would come and talk about it, I said, absolutely. They asked, what do you want me to talk about? You pick the topic. That's always dangerous, right? To have a broad palette of topics that you can pick. And in some ways, I can't believe that you asked a politician to give a talk about ethics. That seemed extremely edgy. But I am thrilled to come back. And there are many areas in public life, obviously in 16 years in elected office and now in a new capacity, where I wrestle with ethical issues. The ethical indiscretions and failings of people in public life have been significantly on display. There are a raft of ethical issues around things like campaign finance, etc. But when I was asked if I would do this, I really kind of narrowed on a topic that I've been thinking about and concerned about for some time, and that is this. We are in an increasingly diverse society. In our organizations, in our cities, communities, in our nation, increasingly diverse. I believe that's a wonderful thing. And yet, the fact that we are increasingly diverse and we come from different backgrounds with different moral traditions makes the challenge of arriving at ethical judgments, policy decisions, what's the best thing to do, potentially thorny. And we see this all the time in current public life, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute and talk about one throughout the speech. But I decided, well, why don't I do this? Why don't I talk about that notion of the common good in an increasingly diverse society? Some would maintain that there really isn't a common good anymore, that there's kind of a moral relativism perspective where it's just really a matter of perspective, and with different perspectives you really can't get at that. Others would say, no, there is always a right answer, even to the point of dismissing minority viewpoints or viewpoints from newly diverse constituencies in the country. And so I want to wrestle with that. Let me talk about some contemporary controversies just to set the stage. 3 things that are in the news right now that are challenging and that deal with issues of diversity and how we arrive at a definition of the common good. The first, the extensive debate about the construction of a mosque in Lower Manhattan. One of the faculty members here, Doug Hicks, has recently written a piece on that. We've all seen that debated in a lot of different directions over the past weeks. That is an example of a top-of-mind topic that's not yet resolved. Second, issues dealing with immigration, the passage of a law in Arizona, Senate Bill 1070, and then more subsequent proposals even to consider revisions of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which in the aftermath of the Civil War and essentially to overturn the Dred Scott decision, one of the things it did was define who is a citizen of the United States. There has been a proposal that we might want to wrestle with the 14th Amendment and think about a different definition. Third, very controversial item that has been controversial for some time is the definition of marriage. In August, there were 2 noted federal court cases, one in Massachusetts and one in California, one dealing with a state constitutional provision, the other dealing with an act of Congress, that essentially declared that the limitation of marriage to couples of different sex are violations of different constitutional provisions. The cases were slightly different, but they were both equally controversial. They're both on appeal, and the appeal of those cases is going to be watched significantly. Those are just 3 examples of hot debates right now that I would kind of put into this same category. The diversity of the American population and different points of view, moral points of view, clashing views of right or wrong. How do they get resolved? And how do they get resolved? I'm less talking about, you know, there's a court system and there will be decisions, but how do we resolve them as equal participants in a political dialogue that is carried out among a nation of over 300 million people? Because whatever we think about whether there is a right answer, whether it's shifting perspective to act, we all have to decide, we all have to make decisions for a nation and move us forward. And so this issue of making those decisions and the big decisions amidst an increasingly diverse population is what I want to spend time talking with you about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this and basically assert a theory of moral and epistemological discernment. So moral discernment, everybody gets it, just in case folks aren't into the philosophy so much. Epistemological would be, what is knowledge? How do we find knowledge? You know, what do we know to be true? Moral discernment is, you know, what do we judge to be the wise course of action? It's less about factual truth than a wise course of action. I want to assert, as we talk about this, a theory of moral and epistemological discernment that I think is fundamentally an American model, that it's rooted in American principles and institutions. Now, they have been informed by other traditions as well, but they're fundamentally American. And these are principles and traditions that assume the fact of great diversity, that acknowledge that diversity is a good thing, and actually believe that diversity can help us attain knowledge and attain wisdom. And so that's what I'll kind of be working toward as we talk. Let's start with a factual proposition at the beginning. Are we getting more diverse as a society? You know, let's start right there. There were, you know, times in America where there were massive waves of immigrants coming from all over the United States. You know, raise your hand in this room if you are an immigrant from another, if you were born in another country, okay? If your parents were born in another country, raise your hand. If your grandparents were born in another country, okay? How about great-grandparents? Okay, we have some long-termers here in the room, but that probably covered the majority of us. There were times in this country, massive waves of immigration. So we've been a diverse nation at other times. Are we getting more diverse these days? I want to talk to you about 3 ways in which we are getting more diverse. First, here's an interesting measure. The percentage of people who speak a language other than English in their home in the United States. In the last 30 years in America, the percentage of people who speak a language other than English in their home here has gone up by 140%. Not the percentage. The number of people who speak a language other than English in their home has gone up by 140%, while the population has only grown up by 35%. So by a factor of essentially 4 to 1, there's been an explosion in the growth of non-English speakers in American households. You will not be surprised to know that Spanish is the largest language spoken at home other than English, but the next 6, just in case you're interested, and all spoke by more than 1 million households: Chinese, next Tagalog, which I believe is a language spoken in the Philippines. Am I right about that? French, Vietnamese, German, Korean all have more than 1 million households speaking. So that's one indication of greater diversity. Second, the racial origin of Americans, changing pretty dramatically. In the 30 years between 1970 and 2000, here's what happened to the racial origin of Americans. White non-Hispanics, the percentage of our population that were white non-Hispanic, declined from 84% to 69%. 15% decline in 30 years. The Hispanic population increased from 4.5% to 12.5%, nearly tripled. Asian American Pacific Islander population increased from 1.5% to over 4%, again, nearly tripled. African American population increased not as fast, 10.9% to 12.1%. The American Indian population stayed about the same, right about 1%. So in the languages that we're speaking, we're getting more diverse. In the racial diversity of Americans, the racial composition of Americans, demography, we're getting more diverse. And let me give you the last one, religious identification. This is a fascinating one. 1990 to 2008, just an 18-year period. The percentage of Americans that self-identify as Christians, Christians of all denominations, has declined from 86% to 76%. 10% decline in 18 years. The percentage who identify as Jewish has declined from 1.8 to 1.2%, nearly a 1/3 decline in the period of 18 years. Eastern religions doubled, small number, 0.4% to 0.9. Muslim doubled, 0.3% to 0.6. But those who claim no religious affiliation has increased from 8.2% to 15% just in a period of 18 years. What's happening within religions is also fascinating in the 18-year period. Also shows an incredible diversity. More than 40% of Americans worship in a church denomination other than the denomination they were raised in. And even denominations that are not changing, Catholics, for example, have stayed at about 25% of the population. The composition of Catholics has dramatically changed. Native-born Anglo-Catholics are leaving the church. Latinos who are coming to the United States are coming in as Catholics, and so the percentage of the population has stayed the same, but the church has dramatically changed. I know a little bit about the Catholic Church since I am Catholic. Only about 1 out of every 12 Americans who are Catholic over age 70 is a Catholic, but nearly 50% of the 18 to 30-year-old Catholics are Latino. And so you see how the church is changing. So the first thing I wanted to do is ask myself, okay, are we a more diverse society or not? And the answer is we are. We're getting more diverse in language spoken. We're getting more diverse in religion. We're getting diverse racially. And I don't see any sign that those trends will change. So wrestling with diversity and the ethics of finding a common good is going to get, more challenging or more interesting rather than less so. Talk about the desirability of diversity. I'm teaching a course right now on the 14th Amendment in the law school, the 14th Amendment, that great Civil War, post-Civil War amendment that added the Equal Protection Clause, among other things, to the Constitution. And that was the first, placement of equality into the Constitution. But one of the main points of the course that I'm teaching is diversity has not always been viewed as a plus. In fact, there's kind of an ambivalent relationship in American government and history to notions of diversity, and all of you instinctively understand that. On the pro side, the Declaration of Independence, our founding declaration, the first of the self-evident truths, all men are created equal. There was an assertion of equality that even though it was limited to men in the verbiage, and even though it was limited to just particular kinds of men in practice, at least it was an Enlightenment era assertion that there is equality of all. That's a pro-diversity argument. We've always prided ourselves on being a melting pot. So there was a political party in the 1850s in the United States, the Know Nothing Party, that was an anti-immigrant party, but it immediately spawned a backlash, and then the party collapsed. One of the the primary movers in this backlash was a wonderful German-American, a guy by the name of Karl Schurz, who was very active in and around the time of the Civil War. Schurz, as a German-American immigrant, really stated the case about America as a melting pot. He said, quote, "All the social and national elements of the civilized world are represented in the New World, where their peculiar characteristics are to be blended together by the all-assimilating power of freedom." This is an interesting one. "This is the origin of the American nationality, which did not spring from one family, one tribe, one country, but incorporates the vigorous elements of all civilized nations on earth." So who is an American? An American is somebody from anywhere, but who has come here and embracing the ideals. I have heard it said, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it said before that, you know, if you move from Tunisia to France and get French citizenship, people don't start calling you a Frenchman. They call you a Tunisian who has French citizenship. You get citizenship in this country, you're an American. So the melting pot idea is a positive one. The Statue of Liberty that welcomes all, positive. But there's been a history also, a reverse history, the opposite side of the coin history, that definitely paints diversity as something not to be embraced, not to be thrilled about, but to be feared or rejected or to view in a negative way. I started off with the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, but the Constitution was written 11 years later and it had nothing in it about equality. Just 11 years later. The first of the self-evident truths had completely disappeared from the Constitution. In fact, more than disappeared, the Constitution was layered with a structure that promoted, protected, defended a caste system, i.e., the institution of slavery. So we embrace diversity, but then in an ambivalent way we seem to have trouble with it. Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to do a lot of talking about Jefferson. You can't give a speech in Virginia without talking about Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is, as Joseph Ellis titled him in his biography of Jefferson, an American Sphinx, very enigmatic, very contradictory, genius, no doubt about it. But you can find quotes from Jefferson that cover just about any proposition on the diversity point. Jefferson wrote that all are created equal. But he wrote in a wonderful book, Notes on the State of Virginia, that was written in 1780, about immigration and about where immigrants come from. Now, he wanted immigration. In the Declaration of Independence, one of the Bill of Particulars against King George was that he had blocked immigration. But Jefferson wanted particular kinds of people to immigrate. He wanted people from England to immigrate. People from England who understood the legal traditions that had been the forebears of American legal traditions. So here's what Jefferson said about the diversity of immigrants from around the world. Folks would bring their own principles from their home countries. Quote, "These principles and their language they will transmit to their children. They will infuse into our law their spirit, warp and bias its direction, and render it a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass." Never heard heterogeneous used as a critique before, but it is in there. The notion of immigration from around the world, people from different legal systems, diversity isn't good. It would take this wonderful system that our founders had worked on and turn it into a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. So, the diversity issue, we are getting more diverse. We have a history as a nation that both embraces diversity but sometimes recoils from it. And now we get to the question about diversity and the common good. If we extend the Jeffersonian question, can an increasingly diverse society, growing as we are growing, increasingly diverse, maintain that there is a common good, or is it just going to be a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass? In my other life in politics, I see a lot to recommend the heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass, theory of things. And we see it all the time. Whatever our political views, whatever our political positions, we can turn on the TV or whatever and see all these clashing points of view and understand what Jefferson was concerned about. The two questions in an increasingly diverse society as we wrestle with notions of common good basically become these. One, is there a common standard that we can all appeal to? Is there a standard, is there a yardstick that people of different religious traditions who speak different languages at home and who are from different countries can all appeal to? And in addition to a common standard, is there an umpire? Is there an umpire that we won't argue with or think that is, got to fix in for the other side? And so that is the question that we wrestle with on big issues of kind of morality and policy in this country. What's the common standard and what's the umpire? Is it just moral relativism and different perspectives, or is there a right answer? These are questions that we have to wrestle with as we confront who we are as a nation. Let me now get to what I think is a model that's a peculiarly American model of moral inquiry. So inquiring about a common good, inquiry is a verb, inquiring is a verb, and it's kind of a process, and it's very rooted in some important American traditions, including important traditions that Jefferson played a key role in. How do we approach the notion of the common good in the context of the contemporary American political and social milieu? So I'm teaching a course at the university law school that I mentioned, which deals with the 14th Amendment and the idea of equality in American constitutional law. And in that course, just parenthetically, and it's kind of related to this, I maintain that much of what we think about the American Constitution and American sort of constitutionalism, we have the oldest operant constitution in the world if you don't count the code of the tiny nation of San Marino. We have the oldest. I maintain that much of what we think about American constitutionalism was actually not created by the framers of the Constitution in 1787, but it was created by Congress in drafting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in 1866-67. That's not an original position. I mean, a number of constitutional law scholars believe that to be the case. That was such a fundamental reordering of the Constitution that it raises all kinds of questions about the original intent of the framers and what that means and the relevance of it given the fact that the Constitution was rewritten. So as I started to dig into this topic, really now focused on the Constitution, I started to focus on the other, pivotal amendment in the Bill of Rights, which is the First Amendment. Looking at the 14th Amendment, which is a very complex structural amendment that deals with citizenship, slavery, equal rights, the relation between state and federal government. It's a very complex structural amendment. I started to look at the First Amendment and realized that there's a structural complexity, but also a structural theme to the First Amendment that is very, very important. I think that the First Amendment basically is more than just an amendment to protect liberties of people. I think it's actually a model for that moral and epistemological approach to inquiry, to learning, and it's a model that assumes that there is diversity, that assumes that diversity is good, and that assumes that diversity will actually help us search for truth, find answers to questions. Talk a little bit about the purpose and the history of the Bill of Rights, and then I'll get to the First Amendment. So you all know, I'm sure, and some of you really know because my brother-in-law teaches here on the faculty, Woody Holton, and he wrote a book, Unruly Americans, about the passage of the Bill of Rights that was a very well-regarded book a couple of years ago. The Congress, after the failure of the Articles of the Confederacy, that period, drafted a Constitution and drafted it without a Bill of Rights. So the Constitution that set up the structure of government, the executive power, legislative, judicial, terms of office, etc., was drafted, but Congress didn't pass a Bill of Rights. After the Constitution was drafted, and the framers were then faced with getting it ratified by the states, they realized they had a rebellion on their hands and they weren't going to get it ratified. It was not going to be ratified without a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was necessary for a couple of reasons. First, regular unruly Americans demanded it. They wanted protection against a strong federal government. The anti-federalists in the drafting process were pitching it. But in addition to doing it for political expediency, those who had framed the Constitution started to realize, a Bill of Rights is a good idea. The principal author of the Bill of Rights is the Virginian James Madison. And Madison, today we would get mad at Madison. We call him a flip-flopper. That's like the worst thing you can say about somebody in politics. James Madison did not think there should be a Bill of Rights. But he changed his mind and became a believer in the Bill of Rights because where he was living in Orange County, he noticed the persecution of Baptist ministers. It's interesting that we're talking about the mosque issue today and treating Islam potentially in a lesser category than other religions. The First Amendment was largely motivated, and Madison became a believer because Baptists, this school has Baptist origins, University of Richmond, Baptists were being persecuted because they weren't ministers with the Church of England. So that led to a kind of a reassessment and then a belief that we should draft a Bill of Rights. Madison drafted 20 amendments that were going to be a Bill of Rights. Congress reworked the 20 and turned them into 12 and approved 12. The states just ratified 10. The current First Amendment was not all put together in one amendment when Madison drafted. It was religion was here, and assembly was here, and speech was over here. It was spread out, and none of them were first. He had 20, and he thought a lot of them were maybe more important than those in the First Amendment. But when Congress took the 12, they combined a bunch into one and turned that one into the First Amendment, the text of which I'm going to get to in a second. There are various theories about what the Bill of Rights is supposed to do. The theory that is the most obvious is it's supposed to allow individuals the right to be themselves, to express themselves or practice their religion or be free of cruel and unusual punishments. They are protections on individuals. That is one way to look at the Bill of Rights. The rights of individuals are paramount. Second way to look at the Bill of Rights, that was actually more the original attitude about the Bill of Rights, is that it was a fence around government. There are things that government could do, but government couldn't intrude past that fence into the lives of regular citizens. So individual protection, check on government power. The Bill of Rights was advocated as a way to set up the appropriate social structure. Remember, the Constitution begins with that felicitous and sort of redundant phrase, in order to form a more perfect union. You know, how can it be more perfect? And yet they knew that it was a redundant phrase or a nonsensical phrase in some ways, but the framers used it. And the Bill of Rights are part of the structure to try to get to perfection or increasing perfection over time. Those are all theories about what the Bill of Rights was meant to do. But I want to assert a fourth theory, and the fourth theory is as I laid it out earlier. I think the Bill of Rights, but especially the First Amendment, is more than a protection, more than a check on government power, more than a social structure. It is a theory of knowledge. It is a theory of how knowledge is obtained and how moral judgments can be made, but then improved upon over time. And so that's what the First Amendment does. Just like the 14th Amendment, I would argue, does things way beyond the confines of the 14th Amendment. Many would say, to use a theological analogy, that the 14th Amendment did to the Constitution as drafted what the New Testament did to the Old Testament. It kind of reimagined, revised it, came up with a new covenant, to use sort of a theological metaphor, and many people believe the 14th Amendment sort of did the same thing to the pre-existing Constitution. Well, just as the 14th Amendment reached beyond its scope in that way, I would argue that the First Amendment does as well, and it's basically a theory of knowledge and moral judgment. So let's talk about the First Amendment. The First Amendment offers a number of protections, and only one of which was unique to America at the time it was put into the First Amendment. In fact, I've heard prominent historians, Gary Wills as one, say that everything in the Constitution of the United States was in somebody else's Constitution before it was in ours. But the framers did a spectacular job of sifting and picking the best and rejecting things that weren't so good. They weren't perfect, obviously. They declared in the Constitution that an African American was worth 3/5 of a person. But in terms of picking the best of the best for the time, they did a magnificent job. But the one thing that was not in any constitution prior to the American Constitution was the protection of religious freedom. The first clause of the 6 clauses in the First Amendment is the protection of individuals' rights to worship or not worship as they choose. That first clause is a religious liberty clause, and it also, in the second half of it, ensures there's not going to be an established state religion in the United States. You can't establish the Church of England and then punish Baptists because they're not Church of England worshipers. So other aspects of the amendment had been in other constitutions, but not the religious liberty protection. And the reason that's important is there's a lot of history about why we put the religious liberty provision in the First Amendment and put it first in the First Amendment. And that evidence comes from the drafter of the precursor of the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson. So some of you know, because there's a great center in Richmond, the Center for America's First Freedom, that deals with religious freedom, that Thomas Jefferson authored the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1777. It's one of the 3 things on his tombstone that he's proud of. Author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. What are the other 2? Founder of the University of Virginia and Declaration of Independence. There was a UVA grad who mentioned that before the Declaration of Independence over on this side, right? But those are the three that Jefferson, President of the United States, that's not worthy of mention. Ambassador to France, not worthy of mention. Vice President, not worthy of mention. These three were the ones that he thought were worthy of mention. The Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom is a lengthy statute with pretty arcane language. I'm just going to read you one section of it. But basically, to boil it down, what the Statute of Religious Freedom said was this: there will be no punishment or no preference to any office holder or citizen because of the religious belief, mode of worship, or lack thereof. We don't punish people, we don't prefer people because of how they worship or how they don't worship. And that was the core of the statute. Now, it was written at a time when people were being persecuted, so you might think that the main reason that Jefferson wrote it was to stop people from being persecuted for your religion. But if you read Jefferson's description of why he wrote it, you find out that it's actually pretty different. Protecting people was important, but there was something that was more important. Here's what Jefferson said. Here's a phrase out of the statute that's really powerful. It's an assertion. The assertion that Jefferson wrote in: truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. How come truth gets to be female? Truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from conflict, unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons of free argument and debate. So Jefferson's motivation for the Statute of Religious Freedom was less, I want to protect somebody from persecution, as truth is great. And if we allow free debate and inquiry, we will find truth. Jefferson addressed the same issue in the book Notes on the State of Virginia that I talked about earlier, that he wrote in 1780, 3 years after the statute. And he expanded it a little bit in a pretty important phrase. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, give them leave, let them do their thing. They will support the true religion by bringing every false one to the tribunal, to the test of the investigation. They, debate and inquiry, are the natural enemies of error and of error only. Had not the Roman government permitted free inquiry, Christianity could never have been introduced. Had not free inquiry been indulged at the era of Reformation, the corruptions of Christianity could not have been purged away. Important phrase. Is uniformity of opinion desirable? No more than of face or stature. Difference of opinion is advantageous in religion. And so the justification, again, for the Statute of Religious Freedom wasn't to protect an individual, and it wasn't to check governmental power. It was the disputes and debates and even clashes between competing points of view will help us find what the truth is and will help us make better judgments. So here he is writing about this fundamental clause that we generally interpret as a clause protecting individual rights, but his justification is much more about the social good and, in fact, the very epistemological question of how do we find knowledge, how do we find truth, how do we decide what is the right thing to do. In that sense, this precursor to the First Amendment that Jefferson wrote lays out not just a protection, but a theory of knowledge. Now we get into the First Amendment. Okay? The example of the Virginia statute that I've laid out is just dealing with religious freedom. And that was carried forward, amplified, and put first in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. But there was more. The First Amendment has other values in it too. They took the other pieces of the amendments that Madison had drafted and put as the 10th or 12th or 15th Amendment. They lumped them all together, the framers, and they made them number one. And they made them number one because they are all related to this broader notion of how do we find truth, how do we find knowledge, how do we advance in moral judgment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. There's one piece. Or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Or abridging the freedom of speech. Or of the press. Or of the right of people to peaceably to assemble, or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Talk about an important sentence. One sentence with 6 protections, protections that you can sort of combine, the way I like to look at them, into a powerful combination. What the First Amendment protects are beliefs, expression of beliefs, association one with another, and advocacy. And all those are put up as number one, the first right that is guaranteed to individuals, the first right that protects against governmental power, but the first right that also lays out a theory of knowledge. Not just an individual right, not just a check on power, a theory of knowledge. How can we discover what the truth is? Now, some in the room are lawyers, and so for the lawyers in the room, you're probably going to recognize some of that. There is a famous dissenting opinion by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in a case called United States versus Abrams, where it's a dissenting opinion where he talks about what the First Amendment protection of speech is. It's to promote a marketplace of ideas. It's not a real extended reference, but it's kind of similar to this point. Others of you, if you're on the philosophy side of the aisle, probably have read John Stuart Mill. Mill was a big believer in free expression, free religion for the same reason. It's going to help us find what truth is. So, now to go back to our question. How do we find the common good in an increasingly diverse society? And how do we kind of know when we're there? And the answer, the First Amendment answer, is basically this. The search for the common good in America doesn't involve a single, and it doesn't involve a single umpire that we can all rely on, that we will accept or abide by. Instead, the American tradition of finding the common good is a belief in a process of dialogue, debate, and inquiry. We have faith in this kind of construction of our civil life, and it's different than what a church's faith would be or what it is to be a member of a religion, but in organizing our social fabric, we have faith that continuous debate and inquiry elevates our consciousness, changes our minds, illuminates principle, and defeats error. The umpire is like the steady elevation of illuminated and enlightened public opinion. That's who the umpire is. It's kind of, I was thinking of what would the analogy be, and there's actually a fairly, strong current analogy. It's like the difference between a mainframe, a computer, and then, mainframe computers are bulky. Let's put desktops in everybody's desk. And that's not enough. Let's do cloud computing. Let's figure out a way to connect the entire network of computers together, and that's how we even gain more ability to find knowledge, disperse knowledge, educate ourselves. The First Amendment model of inquiry is kind of like the cloud computing model of inquiry, but written by framers who had no idea that there would ever be an internet, and ever be computers, ever be cloud computing, and yet that's kind of what it's like. And in this communal task, diversity is now not something to be feared or something negative. It's actually a positive, because the diverse viewpoints subjects every idea and claim to a rigorous critique. It advances the process of debate and inquiry and helps us discern the true from the false and learn as we go. Now, some of you might recognize this basic thing because there's a lot of analogies to this notion of the First Amendment protection of belief, expression, advocacy, and association as a positive good in moral inquiry, because there's a lot of other institutions in society that we set up exactly the same way. Jury trial. Jury trial is not just about jury of your peer, it's about jury of your peers. The notion that if you get a 6 or 7 or 12, which tend to be the numbers we use in juries around a table, they'll look at it from different points of view, they'll kick it around, and not only is it not the government, it's your peers, it's a group of peers that will look at things from different points of view and will come up with a better answer that will more closely meet the truth than if it was just 1 or 2 people. Philosophy. For the Hegel students, the First Amendment is kind of like a civic version of the Hegelian dialectic. Knowledge is advanced by the assertion of a thesis. And then a critic comes along and asserts an antithesis. And then a comparison of the thesis and antithesis produces a synthesis. And then that synthesis becomes the next thesis around which there's a next antithesis, and it goes on forever. It's a Hegelian principle. In science, the scientific method, testing hypotheses, rejecting hypotheses, and embracing others. And so much of science is about learning something that you didn't start out to learn, but in the rejection of hypotheses, you learn new things. Economics, the notion of the marketplace, the Smith notion that came from that period of Scottish moral philosophy. Theologians, if there's any theologians in the audience who are interested in Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit theologian, he had this complex theory about theology that led him to basically be told by the Catholic Church he shouldn't teach anymore. But his theory, and he's 1950s era, was the universe strives toward a higher consciousness. That the process of learning from one another and debating is an elevation of our moral consciousness. That would be a theological notion. And Lincoln actually said something along these lines in his second inaugural address. In the last paragraph, he says, with firmness in the right, we all shouldn't be moral relativists, namby-pamby about our ideas, with firmness in the right. But then he qualified it as God gives us to see what is right. There was a humility to the phrase and an acknowledgement that we should be strong in our beliefs, but we also have to acknowledge that we're humble and we're not omniscient. That's why this notion of kind of moral inquiry and finding the common good through the continuous process of advancing rather than relying on an umpire is not the same as moral relativism. Moral relativism would assert that there's a lot of perspectives and the perspectives are equally valid. No, the First Amendment theory that I've kind of laid out says there's a right answer. There is truth with a capital T. All those quotes that I was reading you from Jefferson, truth is always capitalized. There is truth with a capital T. The structure of the First Amendment is to suggest to be humble about our ability to know what the right answer is. And we have to be humble about our ability to ever claim that we have completely arrived at what the right answer is. But we can get closer to the right answer through putting our answer out there, listening to others in this very robust dialogue. So that is where I work myself to around the notion of how do you find common good in an increasingly diverse society. It's this: the diversity helps you, not hurts you. Because the diversity exposes you to all these different points of view that you might not think of. You're a humble human being. You're not going to think of them all. We all are. But the diversity of points of view enables us to check, recheck, rebalance, refine our points of view, and have an elevated moral sense and an elevated knowledge. Now, there are some problems with this model that I've laid out. At least some, and I've only thought about them for a little bit. There's probably a lot more that I'm going to tell you. First is if the search for the moral good depends upon this back and forth of ideas in a diverse society, what about minority viewpoints that can get drowned out? So there can be minority viewpoints, and it could be racial minority, religious minority, or just minority offbeat points of view, heterodox ideas. They can get drowned out in a nation of 300 plus million people. And so there's a problem there, although it's often the case that the dissenting minority view, in law and in life 50 years ago becomes a majority view today. A second important issue which suggests, as we think about this, that there might need to, you have to think about it as a reformer, is that there are barriers to entry into the debate. So, we've got folks from the press here. If you have a press that has the capacity to run a printing press and to buy ink, your view can be heard. But if you don't, maybe your view can't be heard or can't be heard so well. And now we're in a time of consolidation of press where there are fewer mainstream press institutions, so are there fewer voices and views, but we also have this kind of wild and untrammeled, internet blogs, information coming at us from every different point of view, even from people who don't have a lot of means. Will they get noticed or not? Well, some do, some don't. Who knows why some things go viral and some things are ignored. And yet there can be barriers to entry into this debate, and that can affect the outcome of it. Here's one: the absence of civility. This whole thing about the First Amendment kind of assumes that we're listening to one another, right? I think listening might be kind of a completely lost art. I mean, who listens to anybody anymore? There's kind of an information segmentation in our world where you have the capacity to watch the one cable channel that just you agree with 100% of the time. You don't have to watch anything else. And anybody can find that one cable channel because there is going to be something that really fits your point of view. Are we basically in an environment now where it's just too easy to get in your own comfort zone and only get that kind of information? That's a significant challenge. On the absence of civility, one of my favorite phrases is, you probably have heard the phrase, it is attributed by some to Jefferson. It's also attributed to an abolitionist by the name of Wendell Phillips. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Have you ever heard that phrase? If we have liberty, we have to be vigilant to keep it up. Well, one of my favorite turns of phrase was George Orwell. When you know what he said? The price of liberty is eternal dirt. The price of liberty is eternal dirt, meaning if there's liberty, you got to put up with a lot of dreck. You know, if there's liberty, they're going to say nutty things, they're going to say wacky things. He didn't say that as a negative against liberty. He's just saying that's a fundamental byproduct. There's going to be incivility. It's going to be messy. It's going to be challenging. The great American poet Walt Whitman said it another way in a wonderful poem, Songs of Myself. He talked about the great barbaric yawp. I want to stand on the rooftops and shout out my great barbaric yawp. Now, he was saying that as a positive, you know, just a primal, here's who I am, and take me as I am. And he was saying that's a great thing about our country, that you can do that. But this issue of civility and are we listening to others is obviously a huge one. So there are a number of challenges to this model, or things that can make it not work near so well as it might. And yet, I would argue that on balance, the model has worked pretty well. I mean, think about it. The Constitution we have is the oldest one in the United States, with the possible exception of San Marino, right? And it's not been, there's an amendment process that hadn't been used all that much when you think about 230 years. A war had to be fought because the whole thing was going to collapse over the issue of slavery. So the Civil War was not a minor thing. But when you think about other nations write and rewrite and revise their constitutions fairly often, we have been able to hold on to ours. And I think that it's not coincidental that we've been able to hold on to ours, and we put at the beginning of the Constitution, the first right, a basic theory of dialogue and inquiry. So I'm going to choose Mr. Jefferson's one phrase over the other phrase. I think Jefferson's opinion that difference of opinion is advantageous is a more worthy Jefferson quote to use than diversity is going to produce an incoherent, distracted, and heterogeneous mass. And let me just finish with one of the controversies that I mentioned at the top, and then we'll open it up to take some questions, and look at it in light of this First Amendment theory, the kind of continuous debate and inquiry theory. And the one I want to talk about is the issue of marriage and how marriage is defined. And the rights of same-sex couples to enter into and celebrate relationships that are accorded either some or all of the civil benefits of marriage. This is an issue that is enormously controversial. I mentioned the two court cases, but you all know we read about this all the time. It's enormously controversial. It's hotly debated in the public sphere. It's litigated in courtrooms all over the country. It's argued before city councils, state legislative bodies, and Congress. It is also an issue of somewhat recent vintage in kind of mainstream thinking. It's only really come into the attention of the broader American public in the last 40 years. And here's the point I'd make about this. Especially in the last 20 years, the entire First Amendment structure, belief, expression of belief, association, groups, pro-marriage, anti-marriage, doing ballot initiatives, and advocacy in courtrooms and advocacy in legislative bodies. The whole structure of the First Amendment kind of epistemological thing, belief, expression, advocacy, and association, has been employed in a major way on this topic. As the debate has occurred, hadn't been, you know, always civil, hadn't always been nice, it's been challenging, claims back and forth, but as the debate has occurred, the public has sifted through competing claims. They've thought more deeply about the nature of sexual orientation than had been the case for, you know, most people kind of in the mainstream public. They become much more aware of friends and family and co-workers who are gay and lesbian, people who had a greater motive to hide their sexual identity because of the stigma that was attached to not discussing the issue. Stigma and silence were self-enforcing phenomenon in connection. And so as this discussion has gone on, in kind of the classic First Amendment way, it's opened up discussion, it's opened up points of view, and it has dramatically changed the popular attitude about relationship equality. Again, I want to emphasize, the issue was a non-issue for most, not for all, obviously. The issue was a non-issue as long as it wasn't discussed. That sounds like a tautological statement, but as soon as it began to be discussed, then it got to be discussed more and more and more and more in all these different forms. And what has happened to the American public attitude on this issue once it's begun to be discussed? In 1996, Gallup did a poll about marriage and about whether marriage should be extended to gay or lesbian couples. 27% of the American public said yes and 68% said no. 1996, 14 years ago. 7 years later, in 2003, they polled again. Now, this time they polled about civil unions, not about marriage. Should couples, same-sex couples, be accorded some or all of the rights of marriage in a civil union? And by 2003, it was now 49% yes and 49% no. It was even. Earlier this year, the Washington Post ABC conducted the same poll. Here was the marriage number in 2010. Gay marriage, 47% yes, 50% no. But civil unions, 66% yes, 30% no. Just within the course of 1996 to 2010, you've seen this sea change in thinking about the relationships between same-sex couples. Let me compare it for a minute to polling data about interracial marriage. The first breach of the ban on interracial marriage was a decision by the California Supreme Court. Who would that not surprise? California. 1948, California struck down the ban on interracial marriage. At that time, 90% of Americans opposed interracial marriage. The Supreme Court of America struck down bans on interracial marriage in 1967, a case from Virginia, Loving v. Virginia. By 1967, 72% of Americans opposed interracial marriage. By 1991, the opposition to interracial marriage had fallen to less than half, and that question isn't even polled today because of where it's moved. So it's clear from an examination of the trend. Now again, all kinds of different moral points of view on this from the doctrine of churches or religions, but in terms of trying to resolve the issue as a civil society, it's clear from an examination of the trend that there is going to continue to be a debate about marriage because it's still slightly no, and the marriage number is significantly different than the civil union number. So there's going to continue to be significant debate back and forth about marriage. And I understand that completely. I understand that on both sides, why one side says anything less than marriage is wrong, and another side says, wait a minute, marriage is something different. There is going to continue to be some debate about the extension of all civil rights of marriage to same-sex couples. But I think we're fast reaching a point of really complete national consensus that same-sex couples should be accorded civil rights that are currently accorded to married people. If not all civil rights, a huge chunk of the civil rights accorded to married. And I would venture to say that on that issue, on the civil union issue, on the extension of rights issue, if it has gone from a distinct minority to 66% today, I don't really see that one going back in the bottle, especially when you look at the polling among young people and the views that they have of this question, which are significantly greater than the 66% number. So I would argue that the discussion about this topic has proceeded in exactly the way that a First Amendment discussion was supposed to happen. Protection of beliefs, protection of expression, protection of association, protection of advocacy. And as that has happened on both sides on an issue that frankly was a non-discussed issue, both sides, and there may be more than both sides, there may be multiple sides, more than just two, have been aired, and people thinking about an issue that they weren't thinking about before have now, in a very dramatic way, started to reach a moral understanding of, you know, hey, here is a better understanding of our fellow citizens and what the basic obligations of fairness demand. So I'll just conclude now and open it up to say, look, there's so many tough issues that we have to resolve in this country. And you can certainly understand why the increasing diversification of our country makes some of the solutions pretty tough. We could have done taxes, we could have done a million things. These are tough issues to solve. But the good news is you don't have to look at our increasing diversity as an obstacle to solution. In fact, you can look to it as an avenue or a path to solution. And the good news is the folks who framed the First Amendment to the Constitution were smart enough to figure it out and put it first for a reason so that it serves that function in our Constitution and in our social order. And that may be one of the reasons why next to San Marino we have the oldest existing Constitution in the United States. Thank you very much, and I'd be now glad to open it up and take some questions.
Thank you, Governor Kaine. I'm John Douglas, the Dean of the Law School, and I was sent up here to tell you that next year there's going to be a symposium on the Constitution of San Marino. And, we're going to invite Governor Kaine back for that. I wanted to join Provost Steve Allred in expressing how thrilled we are in the law school to have Governor Kaine back on our faculty, and how pleased we are that when we gave him the opportunity to teach any course that he wanted, he said, I want to teach a course on constitutional history, and I want to address the issue of equality. It's absolutely fundamental, and we're thrilled that he's chosen to share that with our law students. My other job is to say the floor is open for questions and to get out of the way of this microphone and invite some of you to step forward. Just you can step
and please introduce yourself as you ask this question.
Please. I'm Jeff Summers. I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on the fact that it looks like we, I guess you would say, make progress through society, and the polls make that evident. But what about your comment that the actual progress seems to be left up to the courts, that our politicians are too chicken reluctant or whatever to actually take the action that the population seems to have reached? They won't be statesmen, they'll only be politicians.
Yeah, and that's a fair critique about a whole series of things, right? And yet, the one other danger of my theory that I've just put out there is it can sound a little bit like, anybody read Candide by Voltaire? Dr. Pangloss, surely we live in the best of all possible worlds. You know, whatever the current status is, boy, it's just right. I don't mean to say that, because the whole theory behind this First Amendment thing is we will be smarter tomorrow, and we will be wiser tomorrow to the extent that we have these discussions than we will be today, so it can keep getting better. However, there is certainly reason for concern about whether courts or whether elected officials, you know, do the courageous thing. Look, I look back at my own political career in 16 years, and I look at things and say, you know what, I wish I'd done that differently. On that one, man, I really thought that I had a really strong point of view, but was it my strong point of view, or was I worried about the next election I was facing? I mean, let's be honest. I've had that self-critical thought, and anybody who's in elected office, I'm sure, has had the same thought. The good news is, using this model, the basic give and take and to and fro eventually, you know, gets people in a position where even folks in power will do the thing they need to do. Maybe not as fast as you would want them to, but that's certainly the history as you look at the, you know, at these issues, some of the issues that I'm dealing with in the 14th Amendment course. You know, wasn't easy, took a war, you know, took all kinds of things, but as long as you have that process open and you don't suppress that free debate and inquiry, you can get there, and the leaders get there because they understand it from their populace. Hey, it's okay to be there.
I see that we have one other question.
Please.
Excellent.
Sorry, you're almost off the hook. Sorry. I'm Thad Williamson in the Jepson School. I actually wanted to ask you a question from the Millian point of view. So his model of politics, as I understand it, is on most questions you have partisans on both sides. And what you want are enlightened, open-minded people in the middle who will be engaged in this discernment and will work out the facts and will listen to debates. And hopefully the political system will be set up so that sort of enlightened middle will be the ruling power, so to speak, the ones that can decide those questions. Well, it would be difficult to characterize American politics in just those terms right now. So, I guess my question is whether to what extent does the epistemological argument you're putting forth depend on the citizens themselves understanding themselves to be part of that process, as opposed to, you think that most people have pretty fixed views. Most people don't go around saying, gee, I think my worldview might change today if I read a different opinion piece you know, in the paper. Most people are pretty hard and fast. So where is that sort of cultivated class of people who are going to, you know, be open to new arguments and make decisions? Where are they? And B, are they an elite themselves? Is that a sort of anti-democratic idea?
I think what a great question. So that's a good critique and a question and a concern about the model. But let me talk about it in a couple of ways. I don't think most people's views are as absolutely fixed as you maybe assert. I think most people, even though I do agree with you that nobody's walking around saying, you know, I'm going to probably change my worldview tomorrow if I read something different. Most people are walking around thinking, you know what, I pretty much have life figured out. I think I pretty much understand everything, and yet nevertheless, we do read things and have experiences that tend to change our points of view. I'm not short of self-confidence, but I can see an awful lot of things that I feel differently about than I did 5 or 10 years ago. Maybe not things I feel differently about than I did last week, but over the course of time, I can see changes in position. So I think that, and I did learn that in politics too. First time I was on city council and I had to cast a vote where I knew I was going to make friends of mine mad. Close friends on both sides. I was like, oh man, I don't want to make these friends mad. They really helped me. But either way, I'm hosed here. I'm going to make some really good friends mad. But what I found out is you cast the vote and you go to your friends you make mad. Well, you know, here's why I thought about it. Well, I still don't agree with you. But you know what? I never really thought about it that way. Okay. So I didn't necessarily get the agreement of the opponent, but in almost every case, I find there are very few voters who are single-issue voters. They got their mind made up and they're not listening. Some may be single-issue on this or that, but there is a broad degree of being able to persuade people that I still believe people have. The second thing that I would say, and Thad, you touched on this, here is a very challenging political dynamic right now that really wasn't your question, but it was an assertion that you made that is true that I just want to reflect on. This is a very challenging political dynamic. The American public is increasingly an independent electorate. Now in Virginia, where we don't register by party, all you know is if you ask people, what are you? So about 30% Democrat, 30% Republican, 40% independent. It's the biggest number. The states that require you to register, you actually know, there's not a single jurisdiction these days where the independent number is not growing. So the number of people who say, no, I'm not a partisan of this or that party, I want to know what you're going to do, I want to know what your philosophy is, and I'm going to make a decision, that number is growing, and it's not going to shrink. I think that one's going to continue to grow. Here's the problem with our political system. It's hard to get elected to office as an independent. So in partisan elections like gubernatorial, Congress, Senate races, right? We've got a guy who's an independent candidate here in the room. Here's the problem, Bill, that you definitely faced as you ran as an independent. The majority of people are independents, but it's hard, or a bigger number of independents than members of the other party. It's hard for an independent to get on the ballot. It's hard for an independent to raise money. It's hard for an independent to have a distribution network of the precinct workers and the poll workers. So we are in this odd situation where the biggest group of people would look at Congress and say, am I really represented in a Congress, whatever the number is between D and R? Am I really represented there when you know, there's 2 independents in the Senate who caucus with the Dems? I don't know the number of independents in the House. It's very small. So that is a political disharmony that we have right now where voters are largely becoming free agent independents, and yet it's hard to put free agent independents into office, and that leads to an odd political kind of misalignment that I frankly think is kind of going to start to sort itself out over the next 10 or 15 years. But that assertion is very true. You want the enlightened folks in the middle. Frankly, whether they say they're D's or R's, you can be an enlightened person in the middle and be an independent or be a partisan. But we make it hard for those people to see folks like them in office. And that is a little political challenge that we have right now. I think I've maybe exceeded time, John. Is that the case?
Well, I think maybe I have.
Okay.
But I fear I must step into this marketplace of ideas and suggest that we have to call it quits. And I know Sandra Peart has a few words of thanks before we're done. Thank you, Governor Kaine.
Thanks very much, John. Our students in the Jepson School get to take a course, or at least got to take a course last spring and will again this spring, called Leadership Breakthroughs with Governor Kaine. And I am sure you can now imagine just what a fabulous course that must be. So thanks very much, Tim. It's my job to very briefly, because I know I stand between you and a lovely reception out in the gallery, thank some people who are responsible for today's events. This is, as you can imagine, a complicated conference. It involves 3 schools at the University of Richmond. We began conceptualizing the conference with a cadre of persons at the Jepson School who are interested in teaching and writing about ethics. And so I'd like to begin by thanking Joanne Chula, Don Forsyth, and Terry Price at the Jepson School. And then we began to speak with our colleagues in the Robbins School and the Law School, and Rob Phillips, Jeff Pollack, Richard Coughlin, in the Robbins School, and then Jim Gibson, Roberta Oster Sachs, and Noah Sachs in the Law School, all helped us organize sessions and come up with good names for our keynote speakers and so on. I should as well thank Shannon Best and Nancy Knock in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, who have done the very hard work of organizing all of us and making sure that we all know when to speak and when the lunches will be and so on. So please join me in thanking all of our helpers. And then finally, I'd like to say that this conference is made possible through the support of the Richard Davoud Donchian Foundation, which is supportive of teaching and writing and doing research about ethics from both a practical and a more academic sort of side of things. And so we're very grateful to them. Lee Selby, who's an officer in the Donchian Foundation, was with us last evening for dinner and then this morning, but he was not able to stay for the entire day. He is, however, most excited about watching all of the talks that we've had today on YouTube. They'll be up soon since we're happening and with it in the Jepson School. And so I'd just like to recognize the Donchian Foundation for all of their support over the years. So thanks in absence. And now I'd like to invite you to join us for a reception in the gallery. We do need to vacate this room since it will change its setup yet again so that we can come back and have dinner. So if you could join us in the gallery. And also, if you do have name tags, we recycle at the Jepson School, so could you please put them in the baskets that you'll see out there. So thanks very much for a wonderful day, and thank you, Tim.